Hello to my fabulous calculus students. It's the 2018 exam, free response, no calculator, and this is 5B. So number 5 just gives us a function, f of x equals e to the x times cosine of x. And part B asks, what is the slope of the tangent line to the graph of f at x equals 3 pi over 2? So my first question for you is the slope of the tangent line. What does that mean? What is that the same thing as? The slope of the tangent line is the same thing as the derivative. Okay, and I again wanted to remind you, if you wanted to pause and just try this whole problem on your own, that is really great practice. The second question is, the slope of the tangent line means that we need the derivative. And so if we're taking the derivative of that function, what rule do we need? And we need the product rule. And what does the product rule say? The product rule says that we need the derivative of the first times the second plus the derivative of the second times the first. There's interesting functions involved here, so see if you can remember the derivative of e to the x. And for the e function, you just repeat it, and then you need the derivative of the exponent, and you multiply that. The derivative of x is 1, so I'm not going to write times 1. So the derivative of e to the x is e to the x. And then let me just give one more example just in case it comes up on the exam. So that derivative would be that you copy the function. What is the derivative of 2x? It's 2, so you're multiplying it by 2. So that is an unrelated random example just to help you remember that. And then what about our mnemonic device for the cosine derivative? So that was our Santa Claus snow cone with our negatives. And we want the derivative of cosine. So that derivative of cosine is negative sine. So we are going to take this derivative now using the product rule. And here we go. So the derivative of the first, the derivative of the yellow, times the second function, plus sign, the derivative of cosine. The derivative of cosine is negative sine times the first function. So you've got the derivative of the first times the second plus derivative of the second times the first. And notice I have my label f prime of x clearly labeled that that's the derivative. If you wanted to write this nicer, it is not necessary, but this is a little bit nicer. So it moved the e to the x to the front, and then it had the positive and the negative just as a negative sign. Again, that is completely not required. Okay, and then the last thing we need to do, it says, what is the slope of the tangent line to the graph of to the graph of f at x equals 3 pi over 2. So what are we doing next? Next, we are plugging in 3 pi over 2. So using my really clear notation for the reader, I'm writing f prime of 3 pi over 2 to indicate that I am plugging in 3 pi over 2. So everywhere you see an x value, you are plugging in 3 pi over 2. So you've got e to the 3 pi over 2 cosine of 3 pi over 2 minus e to the 3 pi over 2 sine of 3 pi over 2. I'm plugging into this one just because that's the previous line I was looking at it, but you could plug it into that first one as well because it's equivalent. The very last thing we need to do is evaluate these trig functions using the unit circle. And I actually got this wrong when I tried it because I was looking at the wrong place on the unit circle. It's been a while. So think about, where is 3 pi over 2? Let's call this A. Let's call this B. Let's call this C. Let's call this D. Which one represents the location of 3 pi over 2? That would be capital D right here. So when I did this on my own, I was looking at B at 90 degrees or pi over 2. I just got that wrong. So looking at D, what are the coordinates at D? 0, -1, which one is the cosine, and which one is the sine, right? So that's alphabetical order. Cosine comes before sine in the alphabet. The cosine is 0 or the x value. The sine is -1 or the y value. So I have e to the 3 pi over 2. I don't have a calculator, so I'm just leaving that. The cosine at 3 pi over 2 is equal to 0 minus sine e 3 pi over 2. The sine at 3 pi over 2 is -1. And you can be finished at this point. If you wanted to simplify a little bit, this is all 0. And then you also have a negative and a negative. So you could also write it as positive e to the 3 pi over 2. But again, leaving it in that unsimplified form is completely allowed, as you know. So looking at the rubric, they give you a point for the derivative, and that's the derivative using the product rule. And you have your trig derivatives and your e to the x derivative. They've got the nice label, very clear label. And then the second point is if you are able to get to that slope, that numerical slope, in other words, being able to plug in 3 pi over 2 to get your slope of the tangent line or derivative. Again, notice that clear label. They plugged in, they simplified, etc. They wrote a sentence, which is not required, but it's very clearly stated. The slope of the tangent line to the graph of f at x equals 3 pi over 2 is e to the 3 pi over 2. Notice how much of that is copied. The slope of the tangent line to the graph of f at x equals 3 pi over 2. That is all copied from the original question, and then they just filled in the answer at the very end. If you have a really clear label, I would say you don't need that sentence. You don't need the sentence anyway, but I'm just trying to say, try to do those really nice labels so the reader can follow what you're doing. And that is it for this question. Great work.